you are already peace activists. But on the occasion of the 75th anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima, followed 3 days later by the bombing of Nagasaki, we would like everybody on this Zoom meeting to commit themselves to taking one action to pressure the Australian government to sign the United Nations Treaty on the Abolition of Nuclear Weapons. Send an email, make a phone call, write a letter to the government, to your local MP, to a national newspaper, to a local newspaper, whatever you feel comfortable doing. But say, I will return the favor of meeting all these wonderful people and talking with them by taking one action. That doesn't mean to say, of course, that many of you aren't taking a lot of actions at the moment, but we would like to ask for that commitment from all of you, please, tonight. One point about our speakers, our dear Joseph in the United States, to come on live would have been 5 a.m. And he said he had many commitments on this day and through to Nagasaki Day, and asked us to take pity on him. So Joe's contribution has been recorded, and we'll play a recording. It would have been lovely to talk to him and question him, but 5 a.m., yeah, we took pity. Otherwise, all our speakers are with us, and we thank them at the outset for taking the time and the effort to make a contribution tonight. And we will start with Lisa, who many people in Australia already know since she's visited us several times. Lisa's going to talk on nuclear testing and its impact on the Pacific's Micronesia. Lisa, for those of you who haven't had the good luck to meet her in the past, is an Indigenous Chamorro woman, an activist, an associate professor of social work at the University of Guam, and president of the Guahan Coalition for Peace and Justice. And she has spoken out for her people's independence from United States colonialism and the huge American bases on her Pacific atoll all around the world. So Lisa, we're so happy to have you with us. And please, over to you.
Thank you, Hannah. Thank you very much, and thank you all for tonight. I'm going to do a screen share, so just indulge.
What can't you get on? What?
Host disabled attendee screen sharing. Can you enable it?
Yeah.
Dennis!
Hang on,
Sorry, Lisa needs to screen share.
Yeah, yes, you can.
Just click screen share at the bottom of your screen.
I have, and I've got a message that says host disabled attendee screen sharing.
Oh, Dennis?
Oh, just hang on, Radiga.
At the bottom it says you've disabled it. Oh, the joys of the technology.
How do I remove that?
I think, Dennis, the problem might be that I came in as an attendee as opposed to a presenter. So you might want to disable for attendees.
Maybe you can.
I don't know how to do that.
Make her a co-host, Dennis.
What's that?
Make her a co-host.
How do I do that?
Go to the list of participants, put your mouse over her name, and right-click and the option will come up.
Oh. It says make host.
Yes.
Yeah. So you should, can you do it now?
Yes, it looks like it's going to work. Hang on, let's see.
Here we go.
Yeah, it's working.
Okay, great.
Sorry,
Okay.
There was a problem there. You still there?
Yep.
Dennis, silence mute your microphone.
All right. No, just
Dennis, you have to mute yourself, Dennis.
Sorry. Hang on.
Dennis, mute yourself.
I think
Okay, there we
he's
go.
done that, Lisa, so off you go.
Okay, wonderful. So as I get started, I wanted to thank everyone for the coordinators, Hannah, Dennis, and others, as well as to acknowledge the indigenous lands, traditional landholders that are all connected to the space in which this webinar is facilitated, which of course is the land of Australia, as well as Guahan and other places throughout the world. And so I have 12 minutes and I have a lot of slides, so I'm going to move quickly if you would just indulge me. So this here is a map of the Pacific, particularly Micronesia. And so most noted for this topic around nuclear issues is the Marshall Islands. And so the Marshall Islands, you can see my cursor here is being circulated. And we have Majuro Atoll here, which is the capital. And then we also have a number of islands where nuclear testing occurred to the northern part of the Marshall Islands. I come from the island of Guahan, which is over here. And this island chain is called the Mariana Island Chain. And so we're quite neighbors in the Micronesian region. And so I'm going to focus first and initially on the Marshall Islands. This is their flag. And this is a map that zones into the Marshall Islands. So as you can see with the Marshalls, as well as with us in the Mariana Islands, we are comprised of many different islands that comprise sort of a collectivity or archipelago of islands. And so with Majuro here as the capital, the majority of the bombings occurred to the northern part of the country. And so most noted, of course, is Bikini Atoll, which is here. But in addition to Bikini is Eniwetok, as well as the island of Rongelap, which is this. And so with the permission of a Micronesian sister of mine who does global advocacy work for the Marshallese on behalf of our people, Ms. Abika Anjan Madison, I will be sharing slides that she's allowed me to share, and largely from the people from the island of Rongelap here. And so as I showed in the earlier map, Guahan is in this area. And so I just want to note that with the nuclear testing that happened in the northern part of the Marshall Islands, a lot of the downwinds actually brought it to the region which the Mariana Islands chain. And so the Marshall Islands, I'd like to share a quote from Mr. Tony DeBrum, who was a statesman, the ambassador to the United Nations, and had many different posts within the Marshall Islands, largely focused on advocacy around nuclear issues. And he is quoted as saying, essentially, that between the years of 1946 and 1958, in that time period, 67 nuclear tests were conducted in the Marshall Islands, equivalent to 1.6 Hiroshima-sized explosions every day for a 12-year period. That was the amount of the explosive power that was detonated in the Marshall Islands. Okay, and so the most popular of those, of course, is the detonation of the bomb that was codenamed Bravo. And this was detonated on March 1st, 1954 on the island of Bikini. And so this picture shows and captures what that detonation looks like. So according to the Marshallese, there's a number of things that are very illustrative for people who aren't from there to understand the experience. One of which is that there was nuclear fallout from the sky over a 3-day period of ash, and that the blast created such light that it can be seen as far as the island of Okinawa of Japan. And so a large part of our being able to sort of piece the puzzle together in terms of the US's plan in terms of things like human radiation experiments and so forth has been accessible through the declassification of documents. And so these are two such documents that has allowed us to kind of put the pieces of the puzzle together agenda. And so this picture is a picture of a Rongelapi's family from the island of Rongelap before World War II. And as you can see, at that time, they were living on the islands in their traditional homelands. This photo is an encapsulation of different images that were taken as part of the experiments in terms of the human radiation exposure of the people from the island of Rongelap. And so as you can see, they were given numbers, and you can also see the result of burns, for example, and other injuries throughout their bodies. This photo is a gentleman named John Anjan, who's actually Abaca Anjan Madison's uncle. He was the mayor of Rongelap Atoll, and so he was one of the many people who were a part of the experimentation post to see the impacts of radiation on human beings. And so he was assigned number 40, as you can see in the placard that's on his lap. And part of his motivation in terms of advocacy around the nuclear issues was the loss of his 19-year-old son, Lekoj, who died of leukemia. And so clearly it's been established scientifically a number of different types of cancer that's connected to radiation exposure. And I also wanted to mention that the research that was conducted with the Marshall Islanders post-detonation was conducted at the Brookhaven National Lab. The research was conducted and led by Dr. Robert Conard. And so as you can see with this young boy, as is the case of Hiroshima, one of the biggest things to contend with the nuclear explosion, of course, is burns, largely flying from the sky, tongues of fire coming down. And then a long-term impact oftentimes is looking at the type of cancer that's thyroid, so thyroid of the cancer of the thyroid. And so in the case of the Marshallese, they were, if there was any indication of nodules in their thyroids were recommended to be removed. This is a picture of a couple. The gentleman was on the island of Rongelap during the time of detonation. His wife wasn't, but as you can see, she returned to the island 3 years after the detonation when they were brought there. And then as a result of the very hot, meaning radioactive environment, cancer concerns manifested later. And so, of course, they were eventually relocated back off of the Marshall Islands, or I'm sorry, of their home island of Rongelap. And so as part of that, there's land dispossession. And to this day, people from these islands have been relocated, some in Majuro, many of them in the island of Ibai. And here's another picture of a woman evidencing the thyroid cancer, and is being examined by the scientists who had come to the Marshall Islands. And so as a result of clearly the environment not being safe, in 1985, the residents of Rongelap were relocated by the ship Rainbow Warrior, a Greenpeace ship, to be able to relocate to another island where there was less toxicity. And so in addition to scientists coming to the Marshall Islands, the Marshall Islanders were also brought to Chicago in this case, where they had access to the more sophisticated equipment to look at the test for radiation. And then this is the scientists coming to the Marshall Islands to examine the men. This picture is of a gentleman who clearly was exposed. He had exhibited thyroid issues, but in addition to that, and you can see in this picture, the stunted growth. And so when you visit the Marshall Islands and you see the general population, sort of this kind of stature is not uncommon to see among the people even today. And this photo is of a woman who was 8 years old at the time of detonation. And she years later went back to her island and visited a church and longs to be able to be buried in her home island upon her passing, because clearly she wasn't able to live in her home island. And so what does that mean in terms of what we're seeing today? And so most notably, of course, the image of jellyfish babies, as is in this slide, which are babies who are born with no bones. But even before the jellyfish babies started to manifest, women were not able to carry a pregnancy to term. Once there was some passage of time, then they were able to carry babies to term. They were born like this, without bones, and were not able to survive for very long. And then you continue to see different birth defects, such as, or issues related to congenital conditions. You see autism, you see behavioral health issues. I didn't show you on the slide, but on the slide of Micronesia, the islands that have been exposed are not just the Northern Marshall Islands or even the region where Guahan exists, but also some of the federated states of Micronesia. And so on Guahan, we have people that come to our islands for medical care. And these folks, we're seeing a trend that we're seeing is babies being born without eyeballs that come for treatment. And then according to ABACA as well, there's babies who are being born with tails. And so there continues to be the danger, obviously. And so there's lots of pressure for these folks to return to their island, which they're very resistant to. There continues to be high levels of radiation, especially in the northern part of the country. In Bikini Atoll, for example, there continues to be high levels of gamma radiation, plutonium, and other radioactive isotopes. And then the famous Guam, as we all know, is prone to leaks. And with climate change issue is very vulnerable to the sea level rising. And so this is a photo of ABACA herself doing advocacy at the United Nations. And so she's been very active with the Nuclear Weapons Prohibition Treaty, and is working on the pressure that's placed on them to return to their islands. She shared with me that according to the Department of Energy folks, they would be provided with some kind of powder to sprinkle whenever they're outside their homes, no plants and no sea life consumption because of the toxicity, and they would have to live on a 100% import diet. Now I'd like to shift to my home island of Guahan, which is an unincorporated territory of the United States. We've been such since the Treaty of Paris in 1898. And so we are probably most noted for having lots of military bases, very popular during World War II, and where the Department of Defense controls about 1/3 of the island, which is more than all private landowners combined and even more than our local government of Guam's land holdings. And so of recent times, there's a big planned military buildup. And so we're constantly going back and forth, even this week, with the Department of Defense in terms of their construction plans and the impact on our cultural properties and sacred sites on our island. In 2010, the Department of Defense embarked on the development of a MERC, which is used for military exercises and preparations. That is the span of about 500,000 miles, 500,000 miles. At the time, it was considered to be the largest training range in DoD possession. And it included not just my island of Guahan, but as well as some islands to the north, which included Tinian, which is noted for being the place where the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs were originated from, as well as FDM, which is an island that is used for bombing practiced by the Department of Defense. In 2014, they announced even bigger, almost 1 million nautical square miles of ocean, equivalent to the size or the states, the area of Washington, Oregon, California, Nevada, Arizona, Montana, and New Mexico all combined. Huge span of space that is in the ocean as well as in airspace that's used for military training. And so this is a map of what that actually looks like in terms of size and scope. And so the military legacy on our island is not a pretty one. It's very similar to the Marshalls with lots of toxicity, poor health outcomes, the radiation exposure, and the land dispossession. And so if you look at this slide carefully, you see here is Bikini Atoll, and you can see the radiation, the radius of exposure of the radiation, and here is our island of Guahan. So you can see how Guahan, as well as some islands in the Federated States of Micronesia, also experience the fallout. This slide, which was obtained, the data of this slide was obtained through the declassified documents, indicate the strontium 90 levels in our yearly water rainfall. And you can see the levels in comparison of Guahan and Majuro between 1968 and 1974. And as you can see on many of these years, Guam's levels is higher than the island of Majuro, which is the capital of the Marshalls. Similarly, in this slide, you see how Guam's numbers of gun film data also very high. Here, another declassified document is where this scale was taken from. And likewise, the dose rate on the island from the time period before Bravo and then after Bravo. So you can see the peak in 1952 of the radiation levels. And so to this day, we continue to fight. We've actually introduced for the 8th time into US Congress for the island to be included in funding through what's referred to as RECA, or the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, that essentially acknowledges and gives compensation to those who are within downwind of the nuclear tests, as well as those who are referred to as on-site participants on the nuclear bases during the testing as well. And so we haven't had any success in this advocacy effort. And ultimately in our region, what's at stake for us clearly is our very survival. Thank you.
Thank you. Oops. Thank you so much, Lisa. That was quite difficult to watch in places, but it certainly reminds us of why we are all united in concern about these issues and determination to get rid of the bombs that do this and the political structures that threaten to do it again now. Again, thank you so much, my sister.
You might ask Lisa to make me the host again.
Dennis says he has to be made the host again for some purpose.
Lisa.
Lisa, can you make him the host again, please?
How do I do that? I go into participants and then I see Dennis's name. And then what do I do under more?
Dennis, what does Lisa have to do?
Okay, there. I got it. Change host.
No, it's okay. She's done it. Between us, we are cooperatively finding out how to manage doing these complicated technical things, some of which some of you, I'm sure, know exactly what we should be doing. The rest of us are learning together, which is very nice. But I'd now like to go on to our next speaker, who is someone very dear to the peace movement in this country, and that's Joe Vallentine. Joe's a lifelong peace and environmental activist and has represented us in Parliament for many years, and it was always wonderful to know what she was standing up and saying, however much, you know, the mainstream parties treated her with contempt and dismissed what she was saying. She was truth-telling, and her role there was extremely important for the peace movement here. So Joe is one of, I think, the national treasures, or one of our treasured elders in the peace movement, and we're really very grateful that she can be with us tonight. And she said that she's going to talk to us about post-pandemic peace dividend. Joe, over to you.
Thanks, Hannah, and thanks to you and Dennis for keeping going with this issue for all these years. So I want to say greetings to all peacemakers everywhere, and it's a privilege to be webinaring or sharing however we are with such committed activists, writers and thinkers about nuclear disarmament on the 75th anniversary of the moment that I think changed the world, when nuclear weapons were used in warfare by the United States against Japan. My heartfelt sympathies to those whose lives were changed forever by Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings, and the families of those whose lives were immediately cut short in the most horrifying way. Hibakusha are now elderly people who were discriminated against in the aftermath in their own country, and so many have struggled on with debilitating illnesses, but they also continue to work very hard for total nuclear disarmament, so respect to them. The radioactive suffering has also affected people in other lands where nuclear weapons were tested, as we've just heard devastatingly from Lisa, thank you, but by France, the Soviet Union, Britain, China, the United States, by India and Pakistan, and North Korea more recently. And of course, there's Israel's unacknowledged possession of nuclear weapons, a grave threat in the Middle Eastern situation. We all know many of these stories. And to some degree, there is wide culpability because we have allowed our governments to be complicit in not only the tests, but the building, stockpiling and threats to use these weapons as mass destruction. Sadly, Australia is up to its eyeballs in cooperating with nuclear weapons states, Britain and the United States. And now I want to pay tribute to the Indigenous people of this land who've suffered from the menace of radiation due to the British testing of nuclear weapons here, and from the ravages of uranium mining, without which nuclear weapons would not have been able to develop. I'm on the land of the Whadjuk Noongar people in the southwest of Western Australia, and I honour our First Nations people, whom I respect deeply, and for whom I hope there will be justice in my lifetime. What I've also been saying for nearly 40 years is that I want to see nuclear weapons gone before I go. finished, dismantled, never again causing threats to humanity and to our fragile ecosystems. Some of us have been working for years to eliminate nuclear weapons, so they're never used again, either by accident or by design. Accidents have very nearly happened, as you would all well know. These weapons are just too risky. Efforts have been made by peace groups around the world for decades to progress nuclear disarmament, obviously not too successfully, although there are thousands less of these weapons around than when I began my journey back in 1972. Reflecting on the ups and downs, the hoped-for breakthroughs and shatterings of those dreams of disarmament over the years, it strikes me that there are parallels with how humans respond to immediate threats as opposed to somewhat seemingly remote threats, which is why I think the current pandemic, which the world is experiencing right now, gives us an opportunity. How quickly we can respond when our very own human lives are at risk, and a related potent issue here is how dealing with this real and current crisis has exposed the weaknesses in our economic and governmental processes, revealing the inequities, even in very wealthy countries, which we'd prefer to ignore. The richest country in the world unable to provide PPE equipment or to provide healthcare to millions of its citizens is disgraceful. And here, ignoring the plight of students, asylum seekers and casual workers, leaving them without adequate support, these behaviours are totally unacceptable. But they are being noticed. So the call has gone up around the world for more money on health and welfare and less on weapons and warfare. It reverberates from country to country with NGOs of all kinds, the people of the world realizing that we're wasting so much, not only in financial terms, but also in human capacity as we struggle for a vaccine to curb this common threat. What a waste of precious resources when we continue to spend money on the military. But this is our chance to recalibrate everything as we plan for a future where social justice is paramount, where we build a kinder community, where cooperation is key to our survival. And that's, of course, not applicable only to humans. The climate crisis has also shown us how the rich and powerful, intent on using up the very last coal reserves, for example, to line their pockets, have refused to acknowledge what is already occurring. More frequent severe weather events causing havoc on the environment, as well as costing human and animal lives. They can still pretend that this is something far away into the future and fool themselves that we don't need to attend to it now. And sadly, too many people are disconnected from the reality facing us. But of course, we do need to give the climate crisis the kind of full attention that we're giving to the coronavirus COVID-19. The same applies to nuclear weapons. Their use seems so far in the past to some people, and their future use not something we want to contemplate. It's far too scary. But face it, we must, with the kind of resolve and determination that is now being applied to the pandemic and which should also be applied to the climate crisis. Medical personnel in particular, dealing with the ravages of the pandemic, are especially alert to this issue. They're the frontliners now, along with other essential service providers. And they know full well that as medical facilities are stretched to the limit in some places, there will be no safe place anywhere should nuclear weapons be used. They know that medical establishments would be totally unable to cope with such a crisis. And what's also absolutely clear is that there is a huge difference between a coronavirus pandemic and the aftermath of nuclear weapons use. The health pandemic, which the global community is now experiencing, is challenging everyone, and there's a race to find that vaccine to deal with it. No such vaccine can be sought to deal with radiation poisoning in the event of nuclear war. So what is particularly galling to the medicos, doing their very best for the general community right now, and often at great risk to themselves, numbers of them dying as they work to save others' lives, is that the nuclear risk is absolutely preventable, whereas a viral pandemic is not. They know that we can rid the world of this enormous, extremely grave risk by simply getting rid of the man-made nuclear weapons. But it's not that simple, is it? When nations in the nuclear club choose to hang on to their perceived power and their perceived privilege over everybody else, quite willing to put the whole global community at risk at every moment of every day. And when 5 of those nuclear weapon states have veto power in the Security Council of the United Nations, they do have the power to block good initiatives towards peace. The Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, SIPRI, in its annual report on military expenditure, put the figure for 2019 at US 1.8 trillion. A shocking amount, that's US dollars, if we can even get our heads around it. Imagine what that amount of money could do put towards the implementation of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. There are 17 of them, and one of which is specifically about peace, but they're all related, and all would place the global family in that kinder, more compassionate society where everyone is respected and with at least a chance of good health. Let us demand the peace dividend which could be available if we redirected the money spent on military establishments. Sadly, Australia ranked number 13 in SIPRI's list of military expenditures in 2019. Absolute madness when we're an island nation with natural defences, no actual enemies. We just take on others' enemies and fight in pointless and devastating wars on behalf of our great friend and ally, the United States. It's now more widely being seen as a dangerous ally, which was the title of a book written by a former Conservative Prime Minister in 2014, not long before he died, Malcolm Fraser. Well worth reading. There are some mainstream commentators now questioning our allegiance to this dangerous ally, and that is welcome. But still, 2,500 US Marines are based in Darwin for 5 months of each year. Still, we participate in dangerous war rehearsals like RIMPAC, about to begin in the Pacific Ocean, with countless ships and 25,000 naval personnel practicing their war maneuvers. And still, we buy large amounts of military hardware to suit interoperability with the US war machine, like the 75 F-35 jet fighters on order with a fault-studded developmental process, and a dozen submarines which will probably be obsolete before they hit the water. And still we host bases on Australian soil which are the eyes and ears of the American war machine, like Pine Gap and Northwest Cape. These facilities tie us right into the nuclear war fighting capacity of the United States. And of course, for Lisa in Guahan, this involvement is far short of the overtaking of much of her island nation's home with American bases and personnel. A sad situation for the Chamorro people, who strongly resist a military intrusion into every aspect of their lives. We need to be aware and to work in solidarity with our neighbours who are struggling to get beyond the yoke of global militarization. The most pressing matter is that of nuclear weapons, with hundreds on hair trigger alert, an extremely dangerous situation. It just doesn't make sense, and it never did, for a few nations to hold the rest of the world's countries to ransom, designing, developing, deploying, and threatening to use nuclear weapons. Perhaps now, with so many nations at the United Nations jacking up and saying we're not going to take it anymore, as they did when the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons was supported resoundingly in 2017, perhaps we have that chance of a breakthrough. We are now at the stage where many countries have not only agreed to sign the treaty, but have ratified it in their own countries. It will pass into law when 50 countries have come to that point, and I think we're only 9 countries short of that tally at the moment. Arriving at this treaty has been a long and sometimes torturous process, but when a group of people in Melbourne decided to focus entirely on such a treaty back in 2007, the ground had already been laid by so many organisations in the years preceding, some local, some national, many international. But I think it was the single-minded nature of their hard work which produced a legal document with good standing in the international community. For decades, too many of us in various groups were advocating on various related issues, and they are all related. So maybe we lacked focus. But I'm very glad to have been part of both streams. the long-standing peace and disarmament groups, beavering away on connected issues, and the ICAN group, which cut through and produced a treaty which non-nuclear nations could see just might force the hands of the nuclear pariah nations, as bans on other weapons of mass destruction have managed to do, like the biological and chemical weapons bans and the generally accepted ban on landmines as well. Even countries which haven't signed up to the Landmines Treaty, for example, realise that they don't have a social licence to continue with the production and use of those weapons. So once more, it's up to civil society to demand the urgent change which is needed once the new treaty is enforceable. The United Nations, imperfect as it is still the best way for us to have a voice, to ensure that our representatives there, which are meant to represent the people, not necessarily governments, actually work for the greater good. As an organisation, the UN seems far off to most people, bogged down in bureaucracy, and in some quarters it's even seen as an enemy trying to dictate our lives, to take away our independence, to force a world government upon us. Well, we don't really need world government as such, but we do need a level of cooperation beyond our normal competitive behaviours, when absolutely everything is at stake. As one of my friends said years ago when we were discussing the proposed treaty to ban mining in Antarctica, countries down at the southern tip of our planet doing their diligent research have to fully cooperate or they freeze separately. This is where we can learn lessons from the coronavirus pandemic. Some countries managing better than others, but all countries recognising the need to at least deal with it, and scientists cooperating across national borders to find that vaccine. We can learn from the mistakes in not dealing quickly enough with climate change. Clear for most humans to see, but lack of action advocated by fossil fuel companies whose assets will very soon be stranded is putting us all at risk. We simply can't afford to extract every bit of gas and coal from the earth. Increasing carbon emissions will hasten and exceed that predicted temperature rise of more than 1.5 degrees. We've probably passed that tipping point already, which is a sobering thought. It seems like perfect storm time when the virus crisis, the climate crisis, and the nuclear crisis collide to put us collectively on high alert. And I'm hoping leading to a change in thinking by most of the world's people. If we want a livable future for our children and theirs, we must change direction from an extractive, exploitative model of business as usual, which is clearly not sustainable, to one where Indigenous voices are respected and all human rights are valued and where the environment is protected. Getting rid of nuclear weapons and putting more of our taxpayers' dollars towards healthcare and welfare and less on weapons and warfare is a worthy aim as we traverse a new pathway. An opportunity offered by the pause of the virus, preventing us from travelling, giving us time to plan for a safer future than what we had before the virus attacked. Let's not squander that opportunity. We must demand what we really want, a pandemic-inspired peace dividend with total nuclear disarmament as a first priority.
Jo, thank you so much for that. As always, sort of informative and factual, but also passionate and giving us some sort of hope and strength to keep on campaigning. Thank you so much. I'd now like for us to move on. Dennis, can you take over the screen so that we can hear the message from Jo Gerson? Joseph is has worked with the American Friends Service Committee for many years. He's Vice President of the International Peace Bureau, and he is President of the Campaign for Peace, Disarmament and Common Security. Dennis, please show Jo's message to us. Dennis, it's not happening yet. Ah, the joys of technology. Ah, yep. Oh.
I want to thank Hannah, Dennis, and the Hiroshima Day Committee of Sydney for giving me this opportunity to again join with friends and comrades in Australia to mark the 75th anniversary of the cruel and catastrophic aid bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The anniversary provides us with an opportunity to continue building the national and international movements we need to ensure human survival with justice and dignity. 2 years ago, I had the privilege of meeting many of you in Sydney, Brisbane, and Canberra. And I have warm memories of those much too fast whirlwind meetings, those conversations and sights. Having seen smoke from forest fires on the margins of Sydney back then, I was horrified and deeply concerned to read about the fires you suffered last summer. I look forward to a time after the pandemic when I can return to Australia to renew friendships and collaborations and to see a restored landscape. Then to the reason we're here. If the U.S. had an enlightened government, this anniversary would provide an opportunity for my nation to face the cruel realities of the atomic bombings, which were targeted against, and I quote, densely packed workers' homes, and to formally apologize for the crimes against humanity that were the atomic and fire bombings that indiscriminately killed hundreds of thousands of innocent people. It has long been my extraordinary privilege to know and work with Hibakusha and many Japanese activists. So as we begin these commemorations, their lives, their agonies, their courage, and profound commitments are not abstractions to me. Similarly, having been to Hiroshima and Nagasaki many times, and having studied the, and having studied the many times the U.S. and other nuclear powers have prepared and threatened to initiate nuclear war, the meanings and dangers of nuclear war are not abstractions to me and should not be for you either. Friends, we live in an era of existential threats, renewed and highly dangerous arms races, the climate emergency, pandemics, and authoritarian governments from Trump, Xi, and Putin to Duterte, Orban, and Bolsonaro. I thus begin with a sense of urgency. Lawrence Wilkerson, former Secretary of Defense Colin Powell's Chief of Staff, recently reported that during the first years of the Trump tyranny, Secretary of Defense Mattis ordered that no significant military actions be taken without his approval. He did that to prevent Trump from launching nuclear attacks amidst one of his rages. Mattis is no longer Secretary of Defense, so we cannot assume that his successor has erected a similar firebreak against the nuclear catastrophe. Wilkerson also warned that Trump is poking his finger in China's eye with aggressive aircraft carrier deployments, and he could initiate a war with China or Iran in his desperate effort to rally support for the election that he appears destined to lose or to steal. Secretary of State Pompeo's recent aggressive statements have deepened the dangers of a U.S.-Chinese armed conflict, and Australia is certainly involved. These provocations take place in the midst of the U.S. campaign to restore its primacy, nuclear and otherwise, in part by destroying the nuclear arms control architecture built over the past 60 years. It began with Bush II's abrogation of the ABM Treaty, their campaign to deploy first strike-related missile defenses, and the evisceration of the meaning of deterrence. Pentagon spokesmen were clear that, quote, deterrence has never been U.S. policy, end quote. Their doctrine for joint nuclear operations say that the focus of U.S. deterrence is, quote, to influence potential adversaries to withhold actions intended to harm the United States' national interest. This can include protecting our oil under their sand, as in the Iraq wars. In the case of President Obama's all options on the table threats against Iran, and Trump's fire and fury threat against North Korea. Earlier, U.S. Secretary of Defense Brown testified that with nuclear weapons, U.S. forces become, quote, meaningful instruments of military and political power. Noam Chomsky explained what this means. It means that we have succeeded, this is quoting him, we have succeeded in sufficiently intimidating anyone who might help protect people we are determined to attack. President Obama was unwilling to expend the political capital needed to transform the nuclear weapons-free world vision of his inspiring Prague speech into policy. Kowtowing to the Pentagon and not wanting to weaken the military alliance with Japan, he extended the U.S. first strike doctrine. And to win Senate votes for the New START treaty, he committed to what has become the $2 trillion upgrading of Washington's nuclear arsenal and for replacing the triad of delivery system. I mean, $2 trillion is a number beyond comprehension. Now Trump has withdrawn from the INF Treaty, violated the UN treaty with Iran, is permitting the New START Treaty to expire, shattered the Open Skies Treaty, and is resisting the Treaty for Prevention of Nuclear Weapons. Trump's Pentagon has reiterated the first strike nuclear warfighting doctrine, stating that nuclear weapons, quote, could be brought into the campaign as a result of perceived failure in a conventional campaign, or in the case of the potential loss of control or regime, or to escalate conflict to sue for peace on more favorable terms. It's deploying more usable battlefield and strategic nuclear weapons to Europe, intermediate range nuclear weapons to Asia and the Pacific, and it threatens through Zoom nuclear weapons testing, possibly in the Pacific. All of this increases the dangers of nuclear war. Friends, history is a contested battlefield. We see this in the racist campaigns to reverse the victories of the U.S. civil rights movement, in futile efforts to reinforce U.S. hegemony across the Pacific and Asia, and in the continuing influence of President Truman's lies about the use and consequences of the atomic bombs. As the novelist William Faulkner observed, the past isn't dead, it isn't even past. Ignorance and distortions of history, as we saw in President Trump's dishonest celebration of the 75th anniversary of the Trinity A-bomb test, make our societies vulnerable to those who would manipulate us and remove the possibility of human freedom. Time doesn't allow for detail, but some things need to be said. In time, the Pacific theater of World War II will be understood as a war between competing imperial powers, primarily Japan, Britain, and the United States. Inspired in part by the Monroe Doctrine, by which Washington enforces its neo-colonial domination of the Western Hemisphere, Japan's elite sought to conquer and create its colonial co-prosperity sphere at terrible cost to Asian and Pacific peoples, not to mention the US and British and Dutch empires. Pearl Harbor was attacked to buy time to prosecute Japan's war for empire, and especially to seize Indonesian oil needed for the war against China. In the ultimate expression of full-spectrum dominance, Hiroshima and Nagasaki were savaged by nuclear weapons. To escape the moral judgment of the U.S. people and history, President Truman lied about the reason he ordered the nuclear attacks, saying they were necessary to prevent the million U.S. troops being prepared for the invasion of Japan from suffering casualties. In fact, for months, Japanese diplomats had been suing for peace on terms that Truman accepted after the A-bombings, that Emperor Hirohito be allowed to remain on his throne. All of the senior U.S. military leaders opposed the A-bombings, which were politically, not militarily motivated. The A-bombings were inflicted to bring the war to an immediate end so the U.S. would not have to share influence with the Soviets in Manchuria, northern China, or Korea. Secretary of War Stimson had advised Truman that Japan's surrender could be arranged on terms acceptable to the U.S., and, quote, he did not want to have the United States get the reputation of outdoing Hitler in atrocities, end quote. Later President Eisenhower opposed the bombing, saying, quote, the Japanese were ready to surrender. It wasn't necessary to hit them with that awful thing. And Admiral Leahy, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, agreed, saying, quote, the use of this barbarous weapon at Hiroshima and Nagasaki was of no material assistance to the war. And it goes on. Friends, we take courage knowing that it is darkest before the dawn. And from the wisdom of 19th century anti-slavery abolitionist Frederick Douglass, who said power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. We also take strength from the vision and steadfastness of the Hibakusha and international peace activists around the world. When I was in Australia 2 years ago, hopes were high that the coming election would bring a Labour Green government to power that would sign and ratify the Treaty for Prevention of Nuclear War. The Conservatives' clung to power was a great disappointment, but we look with hope to the future. If even one or more of the umbrella states breaks ranks with the nuclear powers, the threads of nuclearism can be unraveled. We hope that by the time the NPT Review Conference is finally convened, perhaps in January, enough governments will have signed and ratified the treaty bringing it into force. Article 12 of the treaty requires governments that have ratified the treaty to press others to sign and ratify it. If they have the courage and the imagination, over time, they could exercise political, economic, and diplomatic power and moral suasion needed to universalize the treaty. That's a big if, but it's an essential if. Here in the US, our first priority must be unseating the despots who would rule us. A Trump re-election will spell the end of the US constitutional democracy. And though Biden is a deeply flawed candidate, his election would provide us time and space for essential organizing and advocacy, including pressing the demand that he and other leaders of the nuclear weapon states declare that nuclear war cannot be won and must not be fought. This can serve as a foundation for disarmament negotiations. With the pandemic's devastations, the US and likely other nuclear powers will not be able to simultaneously reinvigorate their economies and spend trillions of dollars for their nuclear arsenals. A profound debate over US national budget priorities, including spending for nuclear weapons, is thus inevitable next year, regardless of the election's outcome. And despite the pandemic, we've been marking and using the 75th anniversary here in the United States for movement building. Recently, with Gensukyo and Hidankyo, Japanese organizations, we held a nationwide webinar to share the Hibakusha's experiences and commitments, to shatter the myths about the A-bombings, and to promote the Hiroshima Signature Appeal and the global peace wave. Many other webinars and local actions, 18 in my home state, are being held to build on the anniversaries. Nationally, a unique coalition of nuclear weapons abolitionists and arms controllers will be holding an 8-hour webinar on August 6th and 9th. And we are preparing for the reconvening of the NPT review, possibly in January. Friends, none of this is enough. Yet, just as we have seen with the unexpected anti-racist uprising across the US in the wake of George Floyd's brutal and criminal murder, as we make our demands and build our forces, the way to a nuclear weapons-free world can open more suddenly, more forcefully, and more successfully than any of us now imagine. May we persist and prevail. Let's work together for no more Hiroshimas, no more Nagasaki's, no more Hibakusha, and for a peaceful, just, and sustainable world. Thank you, and carry on.
Thanks very much, Jeff.
Dennis? Dennis, you're muted. What are you?
Over to you now.
Okay, thank you. It's now my pleasure to introduce Dave Sweeney. Dave's been active in mining, resource, and nuclear issues for 3 decades through his work with the media, with trade unions, and environmental groups. He was a foundation member of ICANN, which was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2017. And he leads the Australian Conservation Foundation's Nuclear Free campaign. Dave holds a vision. He says this about himself, and I rather like it. He holds a vision of an Australia that is thoughtful and positive about its future and honest about its past. Dave's going to talk to us about I Can and We Must, People's Action for Nuclear Weapons Abolition. Thank you, Dave.
Thank you very much, Hannah. And thanks to the Sydney Hiroshima Day Committee for the invitation and for pulling this together, Hannah and Dennis in particular. 60 years of witness and action and advocacy for abolition. That's an important and great record, and I'm really pleased to be here tonight. I'm talking from the Wurundjeri lands of the Kulin Nation in Melbourne, and that's country, like all of Australia, where sovereignty's never been ceded. And I pay my respects to the people of this country and all the nations, the First Nations of Australia, and to traditional owners, Lisa and others, traditional owners and Indigenous people everywhere who've been disproportionately and adversely impacted by the nuclear industry and all aspects of this industry, from the first shovel to the last barrel. And tonight's story, the impacts of nuclear testing in particular, as Lisa said, in the Pacific, 9,000 Hiroshima bombs on an island, on an ocean named as the Sea of Peace. I'm talking from Melbourne, and Joe Val's point of COVID as a sharp reminder of how dramatically things can change and how dramatically a state response can then change in response to external circumstances is very sharply brought home in this place where I am now. We are living, not to go on, there's many people around the world that have much harder, but it's strange to be in Australia, to not be able to go outside your door after 8 o'clock in the evening until 5 o'clock in the morning, to have to mask up, to have a 5-kilometre exclusion zone, and to need a purpose or have a permit to be out. Very strange, but also if we look at the massive amounts of capital, the massive amounts of political intervention to address this, it's exactly as Joe said, the sort of urgency and scale that we need and can do to address this great existential threat that is nuclear weapons. My day job with ACF, the Australian Conservation Foundation, is basically to remove Australia from involvement in the nuclear trade, to move us away from being a uranium miner and exporter, and to be part of the transition from an enabler of dirty energy to a user and a promoter of clean energy. It's to promote responsible radioactive waste management, not impose dumping on remote or regional or Indigenous communities. And it's to end support for US nuclear warfighting plans and capacity. Today is a very special day, I agree, as I often do, in the wake of Jo Vallentine, with her assessment that this is a day that changed the world utterly, because we went from knowing we could inflict harm on ourselves to understanding that we could end ourselves. It was a profound day, knowing that our technical capacity now gave us the ability, the capacity to end life on Earth. And if you look at some of the responses of people at that time, Robert Oppenheimer, who headed up the Manhattan Project, quoted the Bhagavad Gita and spoke about, now I've become death, the destroyer of worlds. Einstein said, if I'd known, I would have been a watchmaker. Those closing bombs of World War II at Hiroshima and Nagasaki were also, as Joe Gerson stated, really the opening salvos of the Cold War. And since 1945, we collectively have lived under the shadow of nuclear weapons and nuclear destruction. And this is a profoundly damaging state of being, and it's had toxic political and cultural impacts. And today, the existential threat of nuclear weapons remains as real, if not more. Tonight, we gather to remember and honour the nuclear victims of the past, but also to reaffirm our commitment to work to end the threat of nuclear weapons into the future. So we are both simultaneously respecting the past and also actively protecting the future. One thing I want to do tonight is acknowledge and thank all who have, do, and will act for peace. I want to share tonight one part of one such action that I've had the privilege to be close to, and that is providing a pathway to a nuclear weapons-free world and real hope. And that's the Australian-born ICAN, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. This, as Jo Val said, born in Melbourne basically in response to inaction, inertia, rage and despair following the complete failure of the established mechanisms to promote nuclear disarmament, in particular the failure of the 2005 NPT review conference. In the early days, there was a strong sense with ICAN of the medical profession, the health and public health impacts and implications of nuclear weapons. So there were activists and academics and advocates who got together, in a very important role played by MAPW, the Medical Association for the Prevention of War. And as Joe said again, there's been much work, but one thing that set ICAN apart was a very surgical, you could say, with that medical background, surgical focus on a legal intervention, a legal mechanism. How come we have nuclear weapons not illegal? We have chemical, biological, cluster munitions, landmines. These things are illegal, or there's conventions against them, but the worst of all is not illegal. Let's use the models, the learnings of those earlier initiatives, those conventions, those restraints to shrink the legitimacy and the political space that nuclear weapons operate in. Let's change the norms. Let's remove any legitimacy of nuclear weapons as a valid security tool, and let's name them and bell the cat and say what they are. They are weapons of mass and indiscriminate murder, and they cannot be tolerated by any nation on this planet. So that sense of a clear legal focus was important, because then it wasn't how do we change this, how do we do this, is it a massive education campaign? It was let's get up a legal treaty. And we set about trying to prosecute that. One of the things too that came from the medical influence of early ICAN was a really strong sense on the humanitarian implications and the humanitarian impacts of nuclear war. Again, partly to move this discourse away from a strategic backroom boys in suits who know lots of acronyms discourse into what this really is and what this would really mean. And the fact that this causes loss by the direction of money away from real human needs, and it would cause massive loss with the push of a button. Initially, ICAN's approach was a bit top down. It was a little bit like, we've got a draft model treaty here, let's go and sell it. And then you get into people saying, no, what about this, what about that? And there was a very early decision in ICAN to not sell a final product, but rather promote an idea and a possibility and invite people to join in. And I think for all of us, there's a real lesson there in building inclusion, offering some sort of leadership or guidance or frame, but building inclusion and being open to the ideas of people, to identify the problem, but have a broad brush solution a broad brush approach to the solution. One of the things, I work with an environment organisation. Sometimes you look at the environment to shape some of the ways you think. And one of the things that often strikes me is the healthiest ecosystems in Australia. And it's been proven again this summer when so much that never used to burn, burnt. The healthiest ecosystems in Australia are the ones that are most diverse. Monoculture leads to high vulnerability. Diversity, inclusion leads to dynamic, robust and resilient ecosystems. And I think it's the same with social movements. So we sought maximum buy-in. We sought to promote the idea of humanitarian impacts rather than strategic considerations. And we sought very focused attempt to get a global legal prohibition. We were fortunate in getting some state party champions, or some nations like Ireland, Norway, Austria, South Africa, Mexico and others, who got on board early and strong. We were fortunate in developing civil society allies and voices, and particularly powerful was International Red Cross and Red Crescent Society, the world's biggest provider, non-government provider of emergency aid and assistance. They looked at the issue and their capacity to deal with a nuclear strike, even a limited nuclear exchange. And they did that in that Red Cross way, very laser-like, very non-partisan, scrupulous and evidence-based, and they came up with that even with all their skills, significant resources and connections, they could not make a meaningful response to even a limited nuclear exchange, let alone a massive one. And they came up with a line which I think is a really powerful one. They said, that which we cannot respond to, we must prevent. And so then International Red Cross and Red Crescent Society became a very strong advocate of the treaty. We held a number of international gatherings in Austria, in Norway and in Mexico that generated momentum, interest, parties talking about it, drafts of discussions, and all this sort of stuff, all this movement building and alliances and evidence started to just generate momentum. And as has been said earlier, this didn't happen in a vacuum. It didn't at all. Another ecological reference or way that I see things is the most dynamic, the largest, the viewable from space living entities on our planet are coral reefs. And they are built. The living, vibrant, spawning part is built on the old, calcified, finished part. The dynamic part of today is built on and owes its existence, its lift, its height from what went before. And so does our movement. So do our movements. They build on the strengths, the skills, the connection, the hope that was seeded by people in the past. We're the torchbearers now, and it goes on to the future. And so ICANN didn't come up with a brand or a one-size-fits-all. ICANN grew on the shoulders of giants and did a specific thing and harnessed, didn't create, harnessed a global energy and a deep, passionate concern amongst people of good faith all around. And that grew till 2017, which was the coalescing year for ICANN. In 2017, there was discussion, rapid, one of the quickest discussions and agreements on an international treaty in UN history. And it got treaty status. We got the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons in 2017. Also in 2017, we were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, which was a magnificent thing and an extraordinary thing. I had the great privilege to be part of some of the crew from Australia that went over to join with Habaksha and many others in Oslo, and just to see that level of depth and recognition for work. Often in Australia, that is something that we'd all be very familiar with. You don't expect awards or accolades in this country for going up against the nuclear industry or the military industry or the dominant political power structure. And to go from that to like a hall with trumpets and the King of Norway was extraordinary. And it reminded me again that the way what is normal in this country is not normal everywhere. And it's not normal for a hell of a lot of people in this country either. And it's important for all of us, I think, to remember that and to see that there are many people of goodwill in this country and beyond that really want to see things change. So where we are now is that we have the treaty and we're now seeking for this to enter into force and then into international humanitarian law, the corpus of international humanitarian law. When that does, and it will, it is inevitable that it will, there offers a whole range of other options: legal options, financial options, ethical options, normative behaviour, political options. So there is many doors open, many opportunities open to really put attention and put pressure on nuclear weapons globally when that happens. For that to happen, we need 50 of the nations that have signed the treaty to ratify the treaty. Today, we have 40. We're 80% of the way there. By the end of this week, we'll have more. There will be nations that will announce, I think, midnight our time tonight, our time Australia tonight, that they will ratify the treaty, and they will do that. So this is the way that it is happening. We will have more, and when it hits 50, it is law, and then Australia and every nation will need to decide. Are we in with the community of nations? Are we abiders of international law and agreements? Do we abide by the rule of law? Or are we an enabler of rogue state weapons of mass destruction? We will need to look at ourselves in the mirror of the global community and confront that question. And I want all our political leaders, and many of them have. There are many people in the Australian Parliament that have signed a pledge to work for the treaty. The alternative government in the form of Labor has signed that in government it will sign and ratify. And as Joe Gerson said, when the first umbrella state starts to fold down the umbrella and actually dance in the rain, that will be a good day. And that will be a day when things start to change. And I would love that change, that little Fred Astaire moment to kick off in Australia. I would love that to kick off in Australia, but I'll be fine for that dance to begin anywhere. But it will happen, and it needs to happen. And let's make that tune and speed that day, because the doomsday clock, as you all know, set up by the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists to measure our proximity to massive threat, to our proximity to extinction effectively, is at 100 seconds to midnight. The closest it's ever been. Closer now than the chilliest days of the Cold War. And it's because of that, because of the twin existential threats of unchecked climate change and nuclear weapons. Now, one is reducing our chances every day, and one could end our chances in a day, and both need direct, active intervention and work, and both are possible to resolve. We made the technology that made the problem. We now need to de-escalate that technology and embrace the solution. The genie's out of the bottle, for sure, with nuclear weapons, but we have fashioned a good cork, a really good cork, and we now need to apply it. We now need to apply it. The majority of the world's nuclear weapons remain between the that bipolar states of the US and Russia. 13,000 of the 15,000. We can turn this around. And the way that we see this and the language that we use is the ban treaty offers us our best way to get rid of our worst weapons. All of us on this call know just how urgent that is. All of us on this call have been profoundly affected and worked hard to make a difference in this space. And I think what the ICANN example shows for me is the power of ordinary people collectively to achieve a quite extraordinary thing. We do that routinely. Let's continue to do that, find the support, the capacity, the strength and the solidarity to continue that journey, because that journey is happening, and we do need to make that choice, because we don't coexist with nuclear weapons. We need to choose. Do they have primacy, or do people and planet have primacy? All of us on this call have made that choice, and now we need to go out there, sell the choice, promote the choice, and change the tune. Thanks so much for your efforts and the opportunity to participate tonight.
Dave, thank you so much for such an encouraging story, and the image will stay with me of dancing in the rain without the nuclear umbrella. That's one of those ideas. I'm almost in tears. It's a beautiful thought. The day when we can all dance in the rain without a nuclear umbrella. It's now my pleasure to call on our last speaker, and that's Emeritus Professor Stuart Rees, known and much loved by many of us. Stuart's an academic, human rights activist, a poet, a writer. He's Emeritus Professor at the Centre for Peace and Conflict Studies at the University of Sydney, and he was the founder of the Sydney Peace Foundation, which awards the only prize in Australia which is given for peace. Sorry. And Stuart's going to speak to us on nuclear disarmament, a life-enhancing use of power. Over to you, Stuart.
Thank you. Thank you, Anna. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Look, it's not going to be easy to achieve what Dave called a sort of Fred Astaire moment, and I'll try and keep my dancing as briefly as possible, but hopefully engaging. I'm going to talk about three things, but mostly I want to talk about the language of violence versus the language of non-violence. The literacy about violence versus the somewhat large illiteracy about non-violence. if we go back to the context of efforts to achieve disarmament, we can start with the first resolution of the General Assembly of the United Nations in 1946, which was about nuclear disarmament, which was about the attempt to control weapons all over the world. And if we then proceed 25 years to the Abolition Treaty in 2017, which was about disarmament and about arms control and about the peaceful use of nuclear energy, you can nevertheless still see and hear what I call the voices of fascination with the language of violence dominant, because in a way the failure of that treaty and subsequent ones prompted the wonderful ICANN initiative. So we then jump another 30 years to the stage in snowy Chile, Oslo in December 2017 to listen to Beatrice Finn and Suzuko Turlo from the Hibakusha movement talking in response to the award of the Nobel Prize. Beatrice talking about the 15,000 nuclear weapons that were ready to go, talking about the culture of fear as though if you built up enough fear about weapons, that would be a deterrent. And the paradox was that the fear, there was a fear also generated that a lot of people did not want to get rid of the nuclear weapons. And then if you listen, if you could, to Suzuko's account of what happened to her in Hiroshima, crawling out from beneath the rubble, watching people, ghost-like figures, she said, crawling by with their flesh hanging off them, with their eyeballs in their hands and their intestines hanging out. And then she used 3 verbs that stay in my memory. She talked about people being incinerated, vaporized, and carbonized, and what a human being on the face of the earth would want to collude with and support that process. But even as Beatrice and Suzuko were standing on that stage, Trump was boasting about America dominating land, sea, and air, and then he joked about having nuclear weapons in space. And almost simultaneously, in Moscow, Putin was arguing, was beating his chest, saying that he had enough weapons to destroy anybody, anywhere, everywhere, at almost any time. So this fascination in policy circles with the language of violence is partly nurtured by a fascinating, by a rather a fearful illiteracy about nonviolence. And so they were presenting to all of us in a way ever since that resolution in the General Assembly in 1946, with the notion that you can only have 2 worlds. You can have a world with nuclear weapons or a world without a sort of typical either or choice. And there's a dreadful irony in that, in the sense that the terms of reference of Alfred Nobel's will talked about fraternity between nations, talked about the responsibility to have regular dialogues and conferences about peace, and that the spirit of that will was followed admirably by a wonderful Buddhist Japanese leader, Daisaku Ikeda, who writes and sends a very impressive peace message, and has done. He's in his 90s now, for every year for about the past 50 years. And there are 2 themes to that address. One is about enthusiastic support for the United Nations, and the other is a desperate plea for nuclear disarmament. I want to now come to my concern about the language of nonviolence, the life-enhancing alternative. And really what I'm talking about here is different ways of looking at the exercise of power. Because the possession of nuclear weapons, the possession of any weapon, the assumption that security derives only from having more submarines and more tanks and more weapons of every kind, derives from a top-down, one-dimensional use of power. You can see it everywhere. You see it every day, unfortunately, in this country and so many others, in terms of domestic violence, the product of this massive illiteracy about non-violence. On the other end of the continuum is this life-enhancing language which has visions for the future, which is about power used only creatively to harm no one. I could start, say, with a reference to Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, the Peace Symphony, which he said he wanted to be a victory for humanity inside and outside the concert hall. And if you recall, the libretto for the last movement, sung by the chorus and soloists, came from the German poet Schiller's Ode to Joy. And Schiller said he wanted that, he wanted his words to be a kiss for the whole earth. So in every walk of the artistry, you can see and hear the language of nonviolence, but in militaristic and defensive and so many political circles, and in you can only hear still, despite what enthusiastic Dave said about the wonderful achievements of ICANN, you hear the language of the fascination with violence, as though force is the way to solve problems. My last illustrations come from really my enthusiasm about poetry, which Shelley told, because Shelley told us that poets were the unacknowledged legislators of the world. And in a way, the achievement of ICANN is a wonderful piece of poetry. Let me give you two examples. One concerns the, it's a poem by a pacifist American poet, William Stafford. It's got the lovely, somewhat ironical tongue-in-cheek title, Great Men Distracted. And he says sometimes commanders try to take us over and they want to impose their whole universe. How to succeed by daily calculation. And then he finishes, I can't eat that bread. What he's rejecting is this one-dimensional, big swagger, argue with your elbows or your fists or your nuclear weapons way of thinking. And that theme was taken up by the brilliant, wonderful, inimitable German poet and playwright Bertolt Brecht, who said he knew all about bread. He wanted to talk about and write about the bread of the people. Justice is the bread of the people, he said. And just as daily bread is necessary, so is daily justice. It is even necessary several times a day. Then he asked, who, friends, shall bake it? Like the other bread, it must be baked by all of the people, plentiful, wholesome, daily. What he meant by that was that, in a way, foreshadowing the campaign to have the nuclear treaty signed, the ICANN, well, I'll call it the ICANN treaty, was about the participation of as many people as possible. I'll finish with a couple of examples from one of the greatest poets about peace, Denise Levertov. She wrote a poem called Making Peace. And she said a line of peace might appear if we restructured the sentence, our lives are making, took long pauses, redefined what our needs really are. And then she came to write about uranium and nuclear weapons in a poem called What It Could Be. And again, this is the philosophy, the language and the practice of nonviolence in every walk of life, because lots of my predecessors in this Zoom piece of artistry and theatre tonight have talked about other social justice issues. So her poem is called What It Could Be, and she imagined that in line with Aboriginal elders in Africa, in the Americas, and in Australia, that they knew that this huge power slept beneath the surface of the earth, and it should be left to lie asleep. It was called uranium. Instead, men had gouged it from the surface of the earth to attempt, apparently, to destroy themselves. What it could be, she said, if we left it there, it would be a choice by all of us not to kill, to show reverence, to bear witness, to have a sign for the continuing act of non-violence, of passionate reverence, of active love. The last piece of name dropping that I'll indulge in, and I haven't mentioned the wonderful Hannah and Dennis Middleton, Hannah and Dennis yet, Hannah Middleton and Dennis Doherty. I'm tired because I'm on, top of the bill. Let me finish with a reference to one of our great inspiring leaders in this movement, the creator of the campaign for nuclear disarmament, Bertrand Russell. You remember, poet, Renaissance man, poet, philosopher, mathematician, lover. And he said there were three things in his life that concerned him most. One was the desperate need for love. The other was the search for knowledge. And the third was the pity for the unbearable suffering of mankind. But he also left us with the note about war, said wars never decide who's right, they only decide who's left. So if we need a better cue to get rid of nuclear weapons, for me, and I'm sorry if I failed the Fred Astaire test, that is it. Thank you, and in a way, good night.
It's an inspiring talk.
Yeah. Sorry. Stuart, thank you so much. As always, you bring the poetry and the heart into our campaigns, and we need that so desperately because there is so much to do and it's often very hard to keep going, particularly in the current circumstances. But I would like to make an apology and then say a couple of other things. The apology is we have already overrun the time, and I have been a very bad chairperson in not stopping people earlier. But although I'm apologizing formally, I don't really mean it. I have been so moved, so touched, so encouraged by all the speakers. I'm full, and so I can live without a few questions and comments. And I hope for those of you who perhaps did have a question, you'll forgive me. And next time we'll plan for a much longer Zoom meeting. I would like, however, to thank our speakers. They have been very special. We are very fortunate to have such people in our movement, giving us inspiration and leadership and information, and making us believe that it's possible. We will get there. We will dance in the rain without the nuclear umbrella. So thank you to all our speakers. Please thank everybody. Please stay safe, stay well, go on campaigning with your heads and your hearts, and let us see the day when the Australian government signs the treaty. That's the next responsibility for us in this country. Thank you so much, everybody, tonight. Good night.
Thank you, Hannah.